Hi, I'm Christopher Wall from the Department of Politics and president of the American Public Philosophy Institute. And this is one of our great events this semester. You know, in the fall we had Michael Naughton talk on the vocation of the business leader, and then Sam Gregg gave a talk on Catholic social thought. And next week we have Ryan Anderson, noted, nationally known speaker on marriage and religious liberty. He'll be speaking next Tuesday, February 7th at 5 p.m. And then the following week, on Thursday, February 16th, we're going to have an informal conversation with Robert George of Princeton. And he'll be talking, as I say, informally about the current state of social conservatism in America. I hope in the next week or so to get up online on our website a few of his recent shorter writings that might be used as a basis for discussion. So I hope you'll have a chance to check those out. Introducing Don Drakeman is interesting. It's not very often that I start off a talk by saying I'm introducing somebody who is a businessman, entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and scholar. I mean, that doesn't normally go together. You know, but in Don's case, it does. He has a very interesting background. He started at Dartmouth and then went to a program in religion at Princeton. Then he decided he needed to make some money for a while, so he went to Columbia Law School as the Harlan Fiske Stone Scholar. And, but then he decided he actually liked those big questions, went back and finished his PhD in religion at Princeton. And then he was doing some legal work, and eventually, you can get more of this in detail, actually. I interviewed him this afternoon, and it's going to be on our website in a couple of weeks. So it's a fascinating background. He serving as general counsel, kind of doing business stuff for a company, and the guy comes up someday and says, oh, by the way, we're going to start this new business in biotechnology. So Don walks out the door, calls his classmate, his roommate from college, saying, what?
Monoclonal antibody.
You know, and the guy gives him the short thing. So he goes into the meeting, talks about and they say, we need you to head up this new part of the country, of the company. So, so he ends up, you know, starting off on a new biotechnology company, and then became, after doing that for a while, became a venture capitalist in the same area for a big firm in London. And then he just started picking up this hobby on the side of being a scholar. You know, he was interested in religion and history and constitutional law, so he did a book on church and state and original intent. And then he got interested in the subject that he'll be talking about today, you know, why we need the humanities, which kind of at the intersection of law and business and, of course, the humanities. And so I'd like to welcome Don Drakeman, and thanks all for coming.
Oh, thanks so much for coming in on, I'm sure the Chamber of Commerce calls this a typical February day or January day down here, but this is awfully nice. So do appreciate your coming in. And I want to start off by telling you about a South Carolina slave from the 1830s to the 1860s. His name was Dave. We call him Dave the Potter now. He was both a potter and a poet. Now, we only know that Dave was literate. It was at that point illegal to teach slaves to read and write. So it's unusual that he's literate and unusual that we know that he's literate. But we only know it and that he was a poet because his poems have been preserved on the clay pots that he made. These were huge farm jugs. I mean, they stand like this high and this wide, and they used them to store meats and vegetables and you name it. So these are farm, kitchen, sort of pre-industrial version of industrial pots. Today, you can find many of Dave's creations in museums around the country. They're in the Smithsonian, for example. And two of Dave's main themes were religion and the usefulness of jars. So here's one from 1859. Good for lard or holding fresh meats, blessed we were when Peter saw the folded sheets. And then 83 years after the founding, The 4th of July is surely come to blow the fife and beat the drum. In those days, his poetry endured only because of the commercial value of the pots. Today, museums preserve those vessels only because of the value of the poetry. So these pots inscribed, and look for them when you go to the Smithsonian or the new museum in Washington, or if you're in Charleston looking at the museum there. Look for these. They're inscribed with rhymes about everything from the resurrection and Independence Day to advertising slogans. Good pots here. These pots are just one of the visible signs of the sometimes unexpected connections between the humanities and the commercial world, which is what I want to talk to you about today. The emphasis recently has been on unexpected, with students, parents, policymakers, everybody wondering what the humanities are good for. Maybe your own parents are wondering that when you're studying the core curriculum here. In fact, Time magazine reported last year that more than 24 Japanese universities will reduce or altogether eliminate their programs in the humanities and the social sciences, following a dictum from Tokyo to focus on disciplines that, as they put it, better meet society's needs. Now, later reports suggest that the outcome might not have been quite that extreme, but it was still entirely believable, maybe even in keeping with the tenor of our technological times, that governments would find better uses for their money than funding the humanities. Even in tough times, people can be tempted to see non-technological subjects, literature, history, philosophy, and so on, as luxury goods, easily abandoned in favor of more practical pursuits. Now, in American higher education, we've been wrestling with this ever since Benjamin Franklin's days. He was the first to propose to add what he called useful subjects to his new academy in Philadelphia, what's become the University of Pennsylvania, where the students would be taught, in his words, now listen to it, what he calls the liberal arts, the classical curriculum. He called it everything that is useful and everything that is ornamental. Doesn't sound too useful, does it? Ornamental. But Franklin urged, art is long and their time is short, and they need to be ready to enter the world. So the focus was on useful education. Turned out that Franklin's time was short as well, and his successor at the academy turned the curriculum back towards the classics. Meanwhile, but the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania has produced our most recent president, so they do still blend the useful with the traditional. At the same time, long before anybody ever coined the term Industrial Revolution, an 1828 Yale report, okay, almost 200 years ago, declared from different quarters, we've heard the suggestion that our colleges are not adapted to the spirit of the age, that they must be better accommodated to the business character of the nation. Business character all the way back to 1828. They were asking then what many are asking now, why pay for people to study literature, philosophy, religion, and history when those same funds could be used to find the cure for cancer or build the kinds of technologies that created Silicon Valley? These simple contrasts, it seemed to me, between the useful and the ornamental, the technology fields and the humanities, I think miss a really important point. And I want to talk today about how much policymakers, decision makers in our governments and elsewhere actually need good scholarship across the fields we usually call the humanities. When I say humanities, by the way, I mean I lump in the social science. I'm talking about everything that studies the human condition. So when I say humanities, think everything that's non-science and technology. Our policymakers need the help from those fields, even on economically important issues. So the humanities have a direct effect on our economy, as well as on the kinds of issues that you study, leading to how we might choose to live our lives. What does the good life mean? What are the right choices for us individually? Well, policymakers are making choices for us as a group. So many superb scholars have made really good, eloquent cases for the intrinsic value of the humanities. That basically means humanities are good for themselves. They don't have to have a reason for being good. They just are good. And I think, by the way, that that's absolutely true. But how do you defend something when it doesn't need defense if it's intrinsically good? So I won't spend much more time on that. The issue, though, is if it's just good for itself, how do you get somebody to pay you to do it? Others have shown that the humanities can make us better thinkers, better writers, better citizens, maybe better people as well. That, too, I think is true. But it's easy for a society to expect us to become better people on our own time. And besides, we all know accountants and scientists, health professionals and engineers who are really good people and really good citizens without ever having studied the humanities. Rather than arguing that the humanities are good for you, which they are, of course, or you wouldn't be here at UD, I suspect, but my point is that society actually needs people to think about this stuff, that our society, our countries need the humanities thought about, whether it's by us or somebody else. As a constitutional history scholar, as Chris was kind to point out, who spent decades as a life sciences entrepreneur, I realized that what we call the real world actually needs the humanities more than the real world thinks. And that's really why I came to write the book and why I came to talk to you, because there are really important connections between the humanities and essential aspects of modern life, including the impressively large parts of our economy that relate to our health. So my argument for society to recognize the importance of the humanities takes the opposite tack from many of the standard humanities defenses. Rather than starting with what humanities scholars do and point to places where that might be useful, I focused instead on the question, what do policymakers need? It quickly became clear that they need things that have traditionally been part of the study of the humanities. And in fact, it seemed to me that the more government power is concentrated in small groups, like, say, the Supreme Court, the greater the reliance on the humanities has been. So I'm not just saying the humanities ought to be important. I looked and found many, many places where the humanities have been important, where the Supreme Court or other policymakers have just cited philosophers and historians and so on, specifically to help them make hard choices in difficult cases. So if you look at the Supreme Court, or if you look at how about a third of the world decides who gets life and death, makes life and death decisions about life-saving medicines, what I found is this common denominator of turning to the humanities for help. So in England, the organization is called the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, which is known as NICE because that's what its initials used to be. And they changed the name without changing the initials. Also, not many patients call it NICE. They just say its name is NICE. It makes all of the cost effectiveness determinations for how the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, and by the knock-on effects of the leadership the United Kingdom has in this area, about a third of the world's global pharmaceutical market make their decisions based on what NICE has to say. So when it makes a decision, for example, not to pay for a new high-tech medicine, that influences both the patients who don't get it and the likelihood that companies will bother to try to develop the next high-tech, potentially expensive medicine. So let's look at a little more about how this effect of the humanities works in healthcare and in the health of our economy. So governments around the world invest $100 billion a year in health research. Okay, that's all the labs and all the universities and all the government labs. $100 billion a year. Why do they do it? It's the government's way of doing well by doing good. The twin goals are healthier citizens through new medicines and healthier economies through the R&D jobs. I mean, it's a win-win. Everything works. People like it because they'll feel better. People like it because they'll have more job opportunities. The reason you get so many jobs out of this is that it turns out that for every dollar of government funding, there's about $1.60 of private funding, venture capitalists like us or companies or private investors. And so there are really $260 billion a year going into life sciences research. And the economists have shown that when the government invests, that follow-on effect, the leverage of getting the private capital, allows the government to have phenomenal returns on its investment. That's why if you look at the healthcare budget or the national budget, everybody goes to bat for the National Institutes of Health. Don't want to cut their budget. They're going to find the cure for cancer. And by the way, everybody's communities need the jobs. One major university study showed that for a state that made a $380 million investment, which I'm disappointed to say is actually not that much in the world of biotech, but $380 million investment, it would have a return of $70 billion. That's a 200-fold cash return to the state, plus healthier and wealthier citizens. It's hard to turn that down. That's pretty exciting. So when it comes to where the government money is going to go, it's pretty easy to see why they prefer pharmacology to philosophy. But we have to look at the assumptions behind those economic returns, because all those rosy health and wealth results actually rely on more philosophy than you could imagine. So the key assumption to that working, the $70 billion you get for the $380 million you put in, is that people will continue to pay for really high-priced medicines well into the future. But if we look at, say, Europe, they're putting in about almost half that $100 billion a year, but they're not paying for the medicines at the other end because their national health services are really being crunched by an aging and not particularly healthy population. And so now they're trying to allocate limited national health funds to a very needy group of people, and they have to make value judgments. Those value judgments as to who gets the medicines, even they realize relate to society more than to science. Just a few examples. Will every citizen get an equal amount of the national medical budget? Or will, if you have a chronic illness, will you get more? Should both taxpayers and the unemployed be treated the same? Are some diseases less worthy of expensive treatments than others? If you have a disease, let's say lung cancer from smoking, should that be treated like something that somebody has no role in increasing the risk factors for? Should saving lives trump debilitating but non-fatal conditions? When they do these trade-offs, they're not trading off one cancer patient against another. They're saying we can vaccinate like 10,000 kids, or we can treat one cancer patient. So these are very difficult, hard to make commensurable decisions. And the questions, and many more like them, are not the focus of what people study in medical school or in graduate programs in statistics or pharmacology. But these kinds of issues are the sorts of thing that in the humanities we've been wrestling with for a long time, from literature and history to religion, philosophy, and politics. Now, NICE has written a white paper on this, like a policy paper. It says the hardest question, which they don't know how to answer, is the issue of distributive justice. So what's going on now is they want everybody to get the same. If you're a cancer patient or any other kind of patient, they want everybody to be treated equally. So they measure your quality associated life year, which is a very complicated calculation, which basically says, how much longer is this medicine going to make you live in a decent way? And they try to figure out how to balance the vaccines with the hip replacements, with the new cancer medicines. So what happens is the cancer medicines are really expensive because it costs just a phenomenal amount of money to develop them. So they're not being paid for. So you have something that's been shown to extend the life of cancer patients. And NICE is saying thumbs down because we can't afford to give it to everybody, and we can't figure out how not to give it to everybody if we're going to give it to somebody. Now, I'm not saying I know the easy answer to that question, but I'm saying that's a hard question. They say it's a hard question, and they say, because nobody knows how to do this, we're going to follow what we call procedural justice, which has been put together by a couple of Harvard medical ethicists based on John Rawls' work. And the goal here is to basically say, we're going to have open public meetings. You can come and you can listen to us talk about how we don't know how to do this. And if you don't like it, you can tell us you don't like it. It's a little more technical than that, but this will do. So this uncertainty about what to do and how to do it has led one local health authority, made up of doctors and nurses, specifically requesting guidance from philosophical analysis. Scientists and physicians can figure out whether a new drug actually extends lives, and the mathematicians and statisticians can figure out what it's going to cost. But science itself can't give you a thoughtful answer to the question of who should have those benefits and at what price. Those questions about the nature of the common good have been the stock in trade of the humanities for many years. Now, the same thing pops up when we look at legal questions and not just medical ones. I once wrote an article with the stimulating title of "The Church Historians Who Made the First Amendment What It Is Today." And I wrote that because that's what happened. The Supreme Court built its wall of separation between church and state jurisprudence on the work of two 19th century ecclesiastical historians. These were like Baptist church by Baptist church, dry as dust, boring what we Baptists are doing in late 18th century Virginia. And because the Chief Justice, nearly 100 years later, lived next door to somebody who was a historian, and he's the Chief Justice's first case ever on the religion clauses of the First Amendment. Chief Justice walks over next door, says, "Mr. Bancroft, you're a historian. What's this First Amendment all about?" Bancroft says he's a huge fan of Thomas Jefferson. He says, "You'll find the origins in Virginia." And so Chief Justice goes over to the Library of Congress. No clerks back then. Takes out the book on Jefferson's works and reads a couple of histories of Virginia written by, one by a Presbyterian minister, one by a Baptist minister. And the next thing you know, we have Thomas Jefferson's wall of separation between church and state. We see the humanities popping up like this. So I'm not just telling you that it should be the humanities, because I have a lot of degrees in the humanities, and many of you will too. But this is, in fact, what's going on. During Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan's confirmation hearings, Senator Kyle asked the question. He says, "President Obama said that in hard cases, adherence to precedent and the rules of construction and interpretation will only get you through the first 25 miles of a marathon." He says the critical ingredient in those cases is what's in a judge's heart. Do you agree? This is the empathy question. In response, Justice Kagan said, "It's the law all the way down. People can disagree about the constitutional text or precedent, how they apply to a case, but it's the law all the way down, regardless." Now, when we actually peer all the way down to the bottom of constitutional jurisprudence, we constantly find the humanities. Justices looking for the original meaning of the Constitution call on archivists, historians, and philosophers of language, while those who prefer a living Constitution regularly have sought out ethicists, political philosophers, and other humanities scholars. And the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case, which dealt with race-based school segregation, they based that decision on the latest research in social psychology and sociology, all part of the humanities in my expansive Big Ten definition. So the language of the Constitution, on its face, any of you who have been reading the Constitution, is that a requirement here every day? Probably not, the Daily Missal. So if you read it, you will see that it doesn't tell you what it means for citizens to have the equal protection of the laws. It doesn't tell you how freely you can exercise your religion, what constitutes an establishment of religion, or even who gets to keep and bear arms. I moved from blue state a blue state, New Jersey, very kind of politically liberal state, to South Carolina. It was very Anybody know what I should? There we go. I'm a high-tech guy. So I moved to South Carolina, which is a very red state, very politically conservative. And what I decided is that the major difference between the two states is the people in New Jersey think that their free speech comes from the free speech clause in the First Amendment. And the people in South Carolina think their free speech comes from the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment. Either way, there's no glossary in the back that tells you what these terms mean. And it doesn't tell you whether the death penalty, for example, is cruel and unusual, or if pornography, flag burning, political speeches, and commercial advertisements are all equally deserving of constitutional protection. Time and again, when they have to make those decisions, they've reached out to works of scholarship when they talk about either what the Constitution did mean or what it should mean in our complex modern society. Now, hopefully, you get the sense by now that scholarship shedding light on the human condition has not only been useful, but really essential in society's decisions about key portions of our economy and how we live our lives. You may think those were good decisions, you may think they were bad decisions, but the humanities have been at the core of those decisions and will continue to be. Now that leads to two questions. First, does that mean all humanities scholars need to drop what they're doing and start writing policy blogs and op-eds? And second, are we getting all we need from the humanities? So one of the perks of being a humanities scholar is that you can do whatever you want. Right? You don't have to focus on this problem or that problem. You can just think deeply. One prominent academic philosopher recently wrote, "My thought that philosophers do not have duties toward members of marginalized groups, unlike lawyers and doctors." But if it turns out that philosophy really will determine the future of a lot of those lawyers' laws and those doctors' medicines, maybe philosophers need to rethink their philosophy. Perhaps especially at state-funded institutions where our tax dollars are hopefully at work. At the moment, the public humanities, the notion of making scholarship accessible to politicians and the general public, is not well rewarded in a lot of academia. In a survey, they asked departments, academic departments, whether they considered the public humanities, this kind of outreach, important for promotion and tenure for faculty members. The affirmative answers, the ones who said, yes, it's important, from various programs were English, 0%, history, 0%, classical studies, 0%. And philosophy, 1%. So you philosophers are doing well here. This is not to say that every scholar has to focus on entirely practical things. Those church historians who gave us the First Amendment weren't trying to influence public policy. And Aristotle has been cited a number of times by the Supreme Court, even though he didn't publish in a policy journal. So, fundamental research is as important to the humanities as it is to the life sciences. in part because there's no way to predict what will be important. Think for a minute, this was my life trying to make a new medicine, and see what the odds are. So in 2012, just a year I picked, the federal government's National Institutes of Health received 63,000 grant applications. So that was 63,000 different requests for money to do something important that would advance human health. So they funded about 11,000 of those 63,000, and they got $16 billion. So that's real money. Based on historical averages, that $16 billion that went to 11,000 different good ideas, maybe in 20 years, there'll be 3 new medicines from that. The difficulty is that it's impossible to tell in advance which of the 11,000 or even the 63,000, because sometimes the stuff that doesn't get funded ends up working, and the things that get funded do not work. So a tiny percentage of these things ultimately work, and the brightest minds in the scientific universe can't tell which is which. Well, the same, I think, is likely to be true in the humanities, where we need to continue to appreciate that there's a need for that kind of basic blue sky, likely to stay obscure work, so that in due course, someday, scientists, physicians, historians, philosophers, judges, even legislators can, in that unforeseeable future, mine those discoveries for insights that will make us wonder why nobody saw how valuable they were in the first place. And so we need a lot of humanities scholarship. You should all do it. Do it as a hobby like I have. It's, you know, you don't even have to like devote your life to it. You can devote whatever part of your life to it you can. So we also need one more thing, and you may be able to help with that as well. Scholarship needs to take into account a greater diversity of viewpoints. I mean, not only are there not too many business folks like me who do it, but we need to look at the makeup of the humanities scholars. So Professor Scott Page, who's a political science and economics professor at Michigan, has pointed to the power of diversity in decision making. So he does this work on the wisdom of crowds. You know, all of us is smarter than any one of us. And what he says is that diverse groups are able to solve problems better than less diverse groups. He divides that diversity into two kinds, toolbox diversity and preference diversity. Academic research tends not to have much of either one. So toolbox diversity says you get a bunch of people with different disciplines, different approaches, different, you know, kind of ways they go about solving problems. You get them engaged with each other, better ideas and better policies will come out. For example, remember those scholars who said, put in $300 million, take out $70 billion? Well, they assumed that somebody would just keep pumping money in to buy those new medicines. They didn't look to see if anybody would. They didn't even worry that nobody would. They just said, well, it used to be that way, so we'll assume it's always going to be that way. Meanwhile, the ethicists who've worked with NICE to tell them not to pay said, oh, we don't take into account whether this has any effect on the pharmaceutical industry. Well, it does. Just like the people projecting rosy returns need to think about whether there's any money to pay those returns with. So what's happening? The government, the UK is a good example. I work with folks in Cambridge, and they developed a very important new drug for cancer that is not available to patients. I mean, the inventors in Cambridge would not get to take the drug because it's not paid for in England. Okay, so government funds, invests with one hand, doesn't pay for it with the other hand. Well, if you're not going to pay for it, why do it? Because right now, they can take advantage of the fact in the US we're still fairly freely funding, but after a while, that's going to slow down or stop if other parts of the world aren't paying. And if it keeps getting more expensive, which it seems to be doing inexorably. And that's an interesting and important issue for this $100 billion a year that goes into life sciences research with the hope of building the economy and building new drugs. Now, I'm not here to argue for more money for more drugs or for paying for expensive new medicines. That was my life at one point. I've made plenty of those arguments, but that's not, it's fine with me right now for today's purpose, say, okay, we're not going to do it. And then you can ask me, how should we spend the $100 billion that is lying around because you're not funding the life sciences? Well, it would certainly pay for some humanities research. So the point is, the left hand and the right hand of government are not talking here. This isn't left and right politically, but this is just people investing with expectation of returns are not talking to the people who are not providing the return because they don't have enough money to do it with. So beyond the toolbox diversity, getting those people, getting the ethicists talking to the economists, beyond that, many of the important issues in the humanities fall within what I think is the more challenging realm called fundamental preference diversity, or we all disagree on important stuff. Professor Page points out that groups where people disagree sharply about what's important can be significantly more diverse and significantly better at problem solving than those where everybody agrees. At the same time, though, those fundamental preference differences will create more conflict. That conflict needs to be worked through, and if you're able to work through the conflict, then the society, if you're reflective of society's views, is going to be able to take to that policy better than one side wins, one side loses. Now, these kinds of conflicts of people disagreeing with each other are often avoided in academia, particularly at the elite universities, because research says there isn't much fundamental preference diversity on social and political issues there. If you look at American research universities, largely PhD granting universities, 1 in 20 humanities scholars is to the right of the political center. So obviously half the public's to the right of the center, half the public's to the left. In elite higher education, it's 19 on one side, 1 on the other. Surveys have shown that these fundamental preferences actually find their way into the nature of scholarship. And I'll give you just one example in my church-state field. Many highly respected professors working in this field, especially at the elite universities, start with the assumption that religious beliefs and religious values should be treated no differently than any other preference. It's like, you know, preferring chocolate to vanilla, or, you know, whatever else might be something that you like, but other people like something else. And they come to the conclusion that there should be a sharp and uncompromising divide between church and state. Religion being a private preference for one thing and not another. Now, I'm not arguing today, again, I've had lots of arguments about whether that's good policy or not, but my point today is that if almost all the scholars at our leading universities, the ones who are most likely to be read at the Supreme Court, start with these widely agreed upon principles, the question is, are those principles that are widely shared in the public, or are they missing an important aspect of fundamental preference diversity? So I'll give you an example. Prayer in the public schools. Anybody go to public school here? Anybody have prayer in the public schools? Yeah, particularly in Texas, I've found that's more common than other parts of the country. So 92% of professors in American research universities oppose prayer in the public schools. And I think if you were to remove from that religiously affiliated universities, probably close to 100% would be against school prayer in the public schools. If you survey the public, 2/3 are in favor of prayer in the public schools. Now, my point is not that the professors need to agree with the public or that the public should convert to the professor's view. You can decide that for yourself. But my point is that if scholarship consistently is based on assumptions that has very little to do with what the public is thinking, or is not reflective of the diverse views found in the public, it's not going to be helpful in trying to solve these issues that I've tried to convince you are really important fundamental issues about our future. So many scholars these days believe that knowledge is merely socially constructed. That is, there really isn't something called truth with a capital T, but only what people at a particular time and place might choose to believe is true. I'm not sure that that degree of skepticism is warranted, and I don't know whether you'll find a lot of it here, but let's say even if it is, Scholars could learn a great deal by exploring how the culture of academia has tended to construct its own worldview. It has constructed a world out of its own preferences rather than what it finds in the world. That view influences the direction, the nature, and the conclusions of their scholarship, and some of that's going to affect our lives, whether it's our access to a new cancer drug or the degree of religious freedom we're entitled to have. Making additional room for thoughtful scholarship from underrepresented regions of the political spectrum will certainly deepen and enrich the scholarly conversations by themselves, but it should also help us lead to better laws and maybe even the opportunity for better medicines. Some of the most powerful parts of our governments have time and again turned to humanities scholarship to guide them in making difficult and controversial decisions. We really do need the humanities. They contribute to the common good of the community by showing us what we have in common and by teaching us how to think about what is good. Thanks very much.
Thoughts on why the left generally accepts the intrinsic value of the humanities at a far higher rate, I would say, than the right does. I mean, my own university, I mean, Margaret Thatcher was born on the humanities in Oxford in the 80s. What is it about the humanities that seems to appeal to the political left at a far higher rate than it does to the conservative right?
You know, it's hard to know. Chris and I were talking about this earlier, that there is a if you look at academically strong undergraduates, the very strong liberal students are much more likely to enter graduate school and enter academia than the really strong conservative students. I was actually, when I saw those statistics first, I was thinking of writing an op-ed saying something along the lines of why your lawyer needs to be a Republican. But it's a little bit hard to know. I think that you know, academia itself has gone through sort of waves on this. And at one point, academia was seen as a very conservative, sort of a place where culture was handed on unchanged. And then it became a place where what used to be handed on was completely thrown out, and the attempt was to replace it with whatever else there was to replace it with. You get groupthink, and there's liberal groupthink and conservative groupthink. I can't explain why it's that way. What I will say is that when I've talked about these topics with audiences that are sort of heavily liberally oriented or heavily conservatively oriented, I tend to get more grief from the conservative audiences. The liberals are saying, yeah, you're right. You know, we should be thoughtful about it. But they don't really have to do anything different because they're kind of, they're in good jobs. Conservatives, particularly conservative academics, sometimes think that we ought not to defend the humanities. The humanities are so wedded to this 19 out of 20 worldview of really quite far left political activism. I disagree with that too. I mean, I think that the humanities are important no matter who does them, but we'll do them better if we have a more diverse community working on them and talking to each other. Yes.
So a couple of questions, so I'll just pick one of them. At one point you mentioned that in a way we need to focus on humanities research in order to help these very small groups who are occupying sort of the heights of power in society and government and the economy today make better decisions. What do you say to people who are just deeply disturbed by the fact that we have small groups of people in heights of power in the economy and politics and society making decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could write a good book about that too. Yeah. The same work that I cite in favor of promoting diversity within the scholarship that then is going to have the knock-on effects on the small groups, would say, generally speaking, that large diverse groups like legislatures tend to make better policy choices than small undiverse groups like Supreme Courts or economic analysts of medicines. And we have, I think, I mean, this is my own sort of view of the history, is we've spent about the last 150 years believing in experts. And now if we don't watch out, we're going to start believing even more in experts as long as they look like computers. And since the computers are just going to reflect what we tell them, we're still going to be stuck with that sort of small group thing. And so I think it's not a bad idea to get all this stuff aired out and political compromise made in a form in which political compromise can be made, as opposed to a Supreme Court, particularly now that the notion of federalism is not followed all too carefully, and so every decision is a national decision for everywhere in the country. So anyway, I think you're absolutely right. Yes?
I'd like to take another step down this path. Oh, sorry.
No, I just want to make sure, because it looked like I pointed to both of you. Go ahead. Take another step.
Down this path.
Yep.
That we've been going down, questioning the value of what humanities is contributing, but admitting your point that it is contributing to policy questions. Just to give two examples of maybe what he was saying, from this administration and the previous administration. I remember there was an interview in the Atlantic, maybe 6 months ago, with somebody from Obama's National Security Council who had gotten a degree in literature and no national security background at all. And then he made it onto the as a top advisor for Obama, and was very influential, mainly in, advising the president on what messages his foreign policy would be sending to the public. And
I'm sure our new president won't do anything like that.
Yeah. So I can't remember that guy's name, but Bannon was the other example I was going to point to. Is that a good thing for national security? I mean, it was with Obama, that drove people like Panetta nuts that this guy was having so much influence in the administration.
It's interesting. I think it was JFK who said, I always believe what my generals tell me, and I never trust the economists. I mean, it's one of the things we don't do well enough now, and probably ever, is evaluate what expertise can contribute to decision making. And part of my job, so I'm like that literature major who's doing national security policy. I'm a religion major trying to create new medicines. And at one point, when the company was kind of young, all the scientists came to me and said, we have one question for you, Don. What do you do? And my answer at that point was, well, I'm the guy who gets the money that pays your paycheck. And you may not think that's really important, but it's part of the thing. But I think that one of the key questions is to think about how expertise, experts are good because they know facts and because they are thoughtful analysts, but they don't necessarily know answers because they might look at the wrong facts and they might analyze them incorrectly. And my question to the experts was, they would come in with conclusions, and I would say, why do you think that? In fact, it was for any of you who are majoring in the humanities, it was really helpful to me in running a science company to be a religion major, because the scientists would come in and say, we should do this. And I would say, I'm just a religion major. I can't see it yet. Walk me through the logic. They walk me through it, they get to a point where they have a little bit of a stumble. And then they'd say, well, maybe we better rethink that. All I did was make them take it step by step for somebody who's, the hardest thing I ever did in college was try to satisfy very minor requirement of taking a couple of science courses. And my punishment was that I had to do it the rest of my life. But anyway, no, I think your point is well taken. I really worry, I mean, I believe deeply in expertise, and I believe in more deeply in knowing the limits of expertise. We don't know those limits yet. And any of you in the humanities, just, or not, whatever field you're in, just ask, why do you think we know what we think we know? What's the reason we know those things you're telling us? You can call it epistemology, call it the theory of knowledge. I just say, you know, how do we know that? And usually what you find out is somebody's really strong argument requires something to be true that nobody knows. And all I'm saying is, nobody knows that. What if it's the other way? And they say, well, that'd be a problem. Yeah. So let's go find that out first. I promised you next. Yes?
How do you see an increase in experiential learning affecting the humanities long term?
So that's an interesting thing. An increase in experiential learning. The question is whether you can do that and continue to have the sort of devotion to basic knowledge and thoughtfulness that comes with, do you call it non-experiential learning, old-fashioned learning? And so I think that, I mean, I've learned a huge amount of molecular biology on the job. And so I think that there can be really valid experiential learning experiences. And I'm all for finding ways to bring people into education that might not be, you know, involved in it, or to get people out of the classroom and seeing how what they learn in the classroom relates to the real world. But you know, sometimes some institutions just want to say, oh, you've been doing this for a few years, we'll put a rubber stamp on that and call it, you know, knowledge. And that may or may not be the case. An interesting question, I don't know if you saw the op-ed a week or two ago. Somebody says, in another 20 years, colleges won't exist. It's just all going to be on the internet, and you're just going to learn stuff and pass a test, and you'll be certified by, you know, a think tank or a computer or, you know, whatever. And I think that's unlikely to happen. Although, if it does happen, I think it will happen first. I mean, this is written by a computer science professor. You know, sure, computer science people can do it on the internet. I mean, that's what they do. But I'm not sure that's as true for every other field. And I certainly would like my surgeon to have some education beyond what the internet provides. Other questions? Yes.
So also kind of going back to this question about the tendency of the humanities to be very left-wing, and then left-wing people to be very supportive of the humanities. I mean, is some of that the fact that the humanities, as they arise in the late 19th century, the 20th century, many of them are simply fragments of moral philosophy that we're attempting to do using the empirical method. So sociology and psychology and anthropology and political economy, and that we're using a methodology for studying human things, which isn't appropriate to human things. And so there's a framework that there's an underlying framework to these disciplines that lead them in that direction, that lead them in the direction of leftist liberal conclusions. And so it's endemic. It's not just a tendency or an old boys club. They always choose their own for graduate school or something like that. But that there's something a little bit more systemic.
I think you're right about that. I mean, there has been a sort of an envy of science and math for a long time in those who study the human condition. And so when you combine two facts or factors, one is this science envy in which people want to apply scientific methods to human behavior, which is very good. And then you have folks who, I guess, want to build in assumptions. I mean, the economists build in the assumption we're all maximizing our economic self-interest with every decision we make. I think that's very unlikely. None of you would be here studying the humanities if you were. But the only way they can measure it in these kind of quantitative ways, and the same with quantitative political science, they make a lot of assumptions about the way people are. My favorite example of interesting sort of moral positions built into social science study is the economic school of thought that basically says your behavior is driven by an ability to be accepted by social circle. And that to be accepted by your social circle, I don't know where they get this stuff, by the way. They come up with what are the right ways to do it. The right way to do it is, in their view, to look at what people in like the caveman days used to need to do for mutual support. This is what society needs. So if I'm a hunter-gatherer and you're someone who's good at cooking whatever I've hunter-gathered, I share my mastodon with you, and you make the mastodon stew, and you share it with me, and we have cooperate. And from that, they take the view that someone who votes in favor of government economic redistribution schemes is a sharer in that way. So if we have a confiscatory tax program, that's the same as me sharing my mastodon. But the cavemen didn't have the government there to say, no, you must do this and you must do that. They worked something out. And I think that we miss that in a lot of the underlying social scientific driven approaches to like healthcare or anything else. So we miss the voluntary nature, the nature of us actually wanting to help our neighbors, our family, our peers for a reason, and not just because the government tells us to. But now we're getting to kind of what I think, which is much less important than what everybody else thinks. Yes?
So judging from your whole tone from this talk, the world's not ending yet, the sky's not falling. So even though Japan, maybe a few universities have closed off a little bit of funding from humanities, but what do you see the current situation? I mean, is it like a worldwide thing that people are like, humanities is not really that important, or is it just, what do you think?
So I think that the trend towards consolidating very complex decisions in things like, I mean, something like NICE didn't exist 50 years ago. The system, the healthcare system in England was more like the one we have here. Our healthcare system is becoming more like the one they have there. And it seemed pretty easy back in the old days when they were just trying to decide, do you want metal crutches or wooden crutches? But now they're making these life and death decisions, and so the stakes have been raised. I think that, at least in the healthcare side, the next 10 years will say a lot about whether we keep developing new medicine. Even President Trump just came out saying, you guys got to get more innovative, create more medicines for less money. And look, I tried to do that for 25 years. It's just hard. Even if we got paid less, it would still be hard. It would still cost billions of dollars, and still 99% wouldn't work. I don't know why that is. So with healthcare, that's an issue. With our civil rights and liberties, they come and they go. Is that good? Is that bad? Is it the end of the world? I don't know. It depends on how your worldview is. I think there's a lot more pressure right now in civil rights and liberties by the lack of a frontier. If you follow 19th century history and you look at minority religious groups, the Shaker community, the Oneida community, the Mormons, by and large they found religious freedom despite laws and regulations where they started by going somewhere nobody else was. They could put geography between them and whoever thought they shouldn't have as much religious freedom as they wanted. And that's how the Puritans started in New England. We kind of run out of room. And when the Supreme Court started deciding about 100 years ago that all of our issues of religious freedom and every other major social issue would be decided at a national level instead of at a state level, there wasn't an ability to say, we do things differently in Texas. And so that raises the stakes. The world's not coming to an end. but it means more small groups are having more power over large bodies of land and many, many hundreds of millions of people. That just sort of amps up the stakes. So, you know, it wouldn't be a bad time to start studying the humanities. Yes?
So as someone who's studying the sciences, I'm a biochemistry major, one of the things I've noticed in people in my field is that a lot of these upper level, you know, PhD researchers will do their work in the sciences, but oftentimes their conclusions tend to bleed into other fields. So you have people who don't really have expertise in the humanities making philosophical claims and not knowing that they're doing so. So how important do you see this cross-disciplinary sort of communication as kind of, in addition to solving problems through cooperation, kind of keeping individuals or having them know the limits of their fields and of their knowledge?
I mean, that's a huge part of what I hope will happen. And when humanities scholars come to me and say, you know, oh, okay, I'm ready to sign on. What can I do that's useful? What I usually suggest is just go over to the science departments or the business school or the public policy school. Talk to people. Just listen to what they're saying. Think about it. Tell them what you do. I found, you know, maybe it's because I do pragmatic kinds of things, but I found that scientists and business folks are often very open to hearing input from those of us who may have thought a little bit more about these issues than they have. But they don't know it. And so they, you know, for these committees for NICE, you know, for deciding on who gets the drugs, I mean, it's just all economists and physicians. I mean, nobody's there saying, geez, you're really dealing with some tough issues here. So I think more talking, I was suggesting, you know, just because I come to town, I might as well tell you what to do. That you know, more humanities people ought to take courses in the business school, more business people ought to take courses, you know, with humanities. I know you've got a core curriculum here, so at least for the undergrads, business folks and science folks need to do that. I think that's terrific. I think everybody ought to do it. It's hard to see it. A lot of my folks I work with grew up in the English educational system, or the European system. And they start concentrating when they're in high school. And so, you know, even the various distributed requirements that people like I went through don't exist for them. And that, I think, interestingly, makes them not see the issues, but when they see them, really interested in hearing about them, because they haven't had, you know, all this heavy stuff forced on them when they were kids. So, yeah, just go talk to people. You know, you don't have to call it, you know, deep philosophical thoughts that will leave you confused and bored. You can just say, what are you doing? How are you doing it? You can say, how do you know that? That says somebody, you know, works for every field. Yes.
I was thinking about that survey in reference where history, philosophy, politics, faculty were surveyed on whether or not they thought public activity, public scholarship ought to count towards their grade tenure file, and most of them thought no. So that seems to me to point to a fear that a lot of people in humanities have, that if they start to justify their existence or their activities on the basis of more pragmatic concerns, or on the basis of their usefulness to the life sciences and problem solving in areas, that they'll lose sight of the deeper question, which is humanities ought to be focusing on telling us how we should live, not just how long we can live if we have a certain kind of medicine. And that's at least part of it. But I also want to point out that perhaps that study shouldn't be taken to mean that those in those fields are not interested in public work. They don't think those public activities ought to count towards their tenure.
That's correct. And so I think that there are some who think that it's actually a bad thing for humanities scholars to go out in public, that they ought to be doing, you know, whatever it is that they're paid to do in terms of generating first-rate scholarship. And that's one of the issues with the research universities. It's scholarship, scholarship, scholarship. And teaching and service and everything else takes a bit of a second position. there is the issue of just, you know, if you're out there making good people one by one, you don't have time to go tell the government how to run things. I think making good people one by one is fine. But I think if you're not thinking about how to make the world a better place, and you're paying with tax dollars, then you have to have a good justification for what you are doing. And we could privatize the humanities, that's fine. I think we would be unfortunate if we did. But I think particularly at state universities where professors in the humanities are paid by us, believing that they will contribute in some way more broadly, perhaps, than just whatever the 18th century poet is that they're studying at the moment. And it's not a bad thing to kind of prod them a bit to say, what else could I be thinking about that would be useful? But the vote against me is 100 to 0 in most departments. So,
well, I see the
votes are with you.
I didn't articulate my own position, but I was trying to articulate the reservations that some people in the communities would have about this line of reasoning. Right. So any succumbing to ulterior reasons to explain their pointed purpose as humanities faculty academic is seen as a threat. So they're very sensitive to that. But I think secondary explanations can be part of the big thing. I was chair of the philosophy department for a number of years, and we were challenged to bring in more majors, right? And what parents want to do is, what can you do with philosophy?
Right.
What I and the other faculty members wanted to do is talk about why you should study philosophy and how it can transform your life. And one has to find a way to do both and just make sure you don't abandon the primary in the effort to address the secondary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really don't think every humanities scholar ought to just, you know, become policy wonks. That's hardly my thought. But of the world of scholars who largely provide little output of the connection to the humanities and the real world, it would be nice to have some. That's all. I'm pushing it in that direction with the understanding that I will make very little progress. But you know, I'm someone who keeps straddling this kind of real world, you know, or life of the mind. I hate to say unreal world, although it can be that too. So you know, I mean, the same with scientists. People who apply for these 63,000 grants, they all say they've got a direct line on human healthcare, but what they really have is just learning the vocabulary. And they don't necessarily have a pathway to making things, but that's what we accept that. But at least thinking about it. Any other questions? You all were very kind to ask interesting stuff, to laugh at least some of my jokes. And I really just respect enormously what you all are doing here, this program today. So thank you for having me here. Think about it. You know, that's all you can do. Think about it.
We have some refreshments, so an opportunity for informal conversation at the little watch. I'm sure if you want to ask a question or two, always be happy to talk to you.